Tuesday, you will have a quiz on Pearl Harbor. Tuesday, you will have a quiz on Midway. Tuesday, you will have a quiz on Guadalcanal. Tuesday, you will have a quiz on the Philippines.
Dad, what are you doing?
I'm practicing my FDR voice for class. I have to get this FDR voice down.
So weird.
What? What? I need this voice. Tuesday, you will have a quiz on... Okay, this is the heart of this review video. This is the Prezi on World War II America we went over in class. Along with the flashcards, along with the readings, and the other links I posted at Edmodo. A little bit of a review of the pre-war preparations done by the United States, the Lend-Lease Act, the Atlantic Charter. Both of those were ways for us to help out our allies, even though we weren't actively in the war. Understand those concepts. In the Atlantic and over in Europe, you had the Germans and Italians aggressively taking over territory and acting belligerently, invading countries, bullying other countries, acting out, rearming, preparing for war. In the Pacific, you also had similar, I'm going to write on these here while we're talking. Pacific, you had Japan doing the same thing with the Koreas, or Korea at the time, there were no two Koreas, China and other areas. Then in the home front, you had us starting to rearm, becoming the arsenal of democracy, starting the Selective Service Act, going through the neutrality acts that start with us truly being neutral to us taking sides. Okay, after some technical difficulties, we're back. We talked about, Pearl Harbor, what the intent of Pearl Harbor was, understand that. This is a far away shot of the map we talked about in class. The dotted red line you see on the map, that was kind of a buffer zone the Japanese hoped to be able to enforce by taking away all of the islands and occupying the islands inside of that red line, attacking us over at Pearl Harbor in the east, destroying our fleet, and kind of being able to keep the United States away from enforcing our will and interfering with the Japanese plans in the Pacific and Asia. Remember, Hitler was not happy when the United States was attacked and was drawn into the war. We talked about war bonds on the home front, how our industrial capacity, I believe in the home front in the readings, it went from around 15% in 1941 and skyrocketed throughout the war because everything was made for the war. There were no consumer goods or very few consumer goods being made. We talked about rationing, the consumer price index, the propaganda that was being put out from cartoons to posters to movies and songs. Executive Order 9066 and internment camps, dark era in our history where Japanese were rounded up both in Hawaii and on the West Coast and moved to camps, losing their property, businesses, and their possessions. They were not very nice places to be placed. Talked about some of the pop culture, the movies and songs of that era. Duke Ellington, Glenn Miller being two of the big band leaders and musicians of that era. We talked about the CPI and the goods and services that it registers tracks the pricing and helps the government monitor inflation and consumer prices. Okay, now we're talking about 1941, War by the Year. Screen's kind of frozen on this recording, but we will discuss it anyway. We talked about the United States freezing German and Italian assets in the United States in 1941. We did not want them to be able to profit or get the money out of bank accounts, stock funds, investments in the United States to be able to buy war materials to attack our friends, so we froze their assets. This is when the Atlantic Charter was discussed and signed. Some other things we talked about. The USO is formed, United Service Organizations, which is the group that goes and helps troops and their families both overseas and in this country. Talked about the Manhattan Project beginning, which was the plan to build the atomic bomb. December 7th, happening, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and some miscellaneous items that occurred in 1941. The Rainbow Bridge opened in Niagara Falls. Supreme Court upheld working restrictions for teens and the minimum wage law. And some happier news, Joe DiMaggio safely hit in 56 consecutive games, along with the Yankees beating the Brooklyn Dodgers in the World Series 4-1. Some of the top songs of that year, Chattanooga Choo Choo by the Glenn Miller Orchestra, and Duke Ellington with vocals by Ivy Anderson, I Got It Bad and That Ain't Good. I will post the Prezi in Edmodo so you guys can take a look and listen to those songs and those other items. Jumping back into 1942, we got as far as the Pacific Theater. We talked about in March and April, the Philippines falling to the Japanese in the Bataan Death March. There's a good article on history.com. You can look that up. And there's also a video on the Bataan Death March. Over 75,000 Filipino and American troops surrendered. They were marched on a 65-mile march up over the mountains in the Philippines on the island of Luzon. Many died, many were sick, they were treated badly. It was considered a war crime. Then April 18th, the Doolittle Raid over Tokyo. You could Google that, look that up. There's also links in Edmodo for that. That was April 18th, where we snuck a carrier in close to Japan and launched bombers. Off that, it was a one-way mission where they bombed Tokyo, didn't do much physical damage, but did a lot of, I would say, morale damage, damaged Japanese morale, raised our spirits because we were able to attack their capital so quickly 4 months after Pearl Harbor. Then we talked about the Battle of Guadalcanal from August 1942 through November of 1942 with the major fighting. And then afterwards, it took the rest of the winter to clean up the island and get the Japanese off of the island, the soldiers that were remaining. And that pretty much goes as far as we're going to go for this quiz on Tuesday. Any questions, please give me an email at dsalvucci@nbasd.org. Thanks.